Today is September 15, 2017, and before we get into discussing various principles, we are going to ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for all these opportunities that we have to learn the principles of reality. Please guide us in the discussion tonight to understand truth more clearly and to reform our way of thinking and our way of behaving in regard to the truth. Thank you so very much. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, just before the meeting here, I was just asking our Heavenly Family about what would be best for us to discuss tonight. Obviously, there's the community rule, which requires a lot of study, and last weekend we discussed the Temple Scroll. And I remember after, not last weekend, but 50 days before that, we also talked about the Temple Scroll. The weekend following that weekend, we had a Q&A. And so I was just thinking this weekend we can have a bit more of a free discussion or less focused discussion in regard to like really focusing on the community rule or on something else, and people can ask questions, and if there's a point that you want to discuss, you can mention that. However, there is something that was crossing my mind that I kind of wanted to start off with talking about, and perhaps it'll generate discussion that'll take up all meeting or the next meeting too, who knows. But I just wanted to mention some things in regard to it, and then we'll see where things go from there. And there are a couple things that have brought this to mind for me to discuss with you guys. So basically, the thing on my mind is certain principles regarding health, but not just health. It goes a lot broader than that. It's principles regarding how we can come to know things and what really is valid information versus not valid information and all that. And I know that you guys have discussed this I guess I was going to say to some extent, but to a decent extent, on the testimonies meetings. And then there was a video that Walter shared, which is the first of a series of lectures by a doctor named Harriet Hall. And it's posted on the James Randi Foundation YouTube channel. And that series is actually a really good series, which I highly recommend for everyone here to watch. I have known about that series for a long time and hadn't seen it. I've been wanting to watch it, but it's, there's a lot to do in life. And so when Walter shared it and he said that it was really good, I was like, okay, I should actually watch it. So I've been watching snippets here and there and watching sections, and I'll watch another section. And so I haven't watched the whole thing yet, but I've watched a lot of it, and it's really good. And actually, I'll mention some other things that are kind of background as to why I was thinking of this. One other aspect is in thinking about the education for the younger people here at the Living Branch Center. We want to make use of the best possible resources, and there are some resources that are very good but may be harder to kind of get into, and then some things which may be easier. And there are some good resources online for general education that are actually very interactive and even entertaining and things like that. Like there are some YouTube channels that are very educational and just interesting, like very interesting stuff, and it's presented in such a good way that anyone of all ages could easily watch it and find it interesting. And yeah, it's really, really good. So I had posted, or I had sent a message to those here at the Living Branch Center with some YouTube channels that are really good educational YouTube channels, and one of them is the YouTube channel for the James Randi Foundation. And that's where this series of videos by Harriet Hall is posted. And the series is on science-based medicine. And so, again, I really recommend for everyone to check it out. And then since Walter posted that, I've been looking at it. I've talked a bit with other people here at the LBC about it, just kind of different of the ideas presented and the principles presented in that series of videos, and had a couple good conversations with Walter about it, and Brennan, and then Anna and Celia and I had a good conversation that included talking about some of those principles with health the other night. And so I was just thinking it'd be good for us to talk about some of these principles, because it's just so important, and the principles extend health. But yeah, it's just really good. It's really good for us to make sure that we understand these principles and that the information is clear in our minds, and that we're able to distinguish between valid and not valid information in regard to any topic. And health is a good kind of case study for doing that. But first, actually, I want to mention, since these videos are posted on the James Randi Foundation YouTube channel, I want to explain a little bit about the James Randi Foundation. And I'm pretty sure I've actually mentioned it before on the calls, but I'll mention a little bit more about it. I'll explain who James Randi is and what the James Randi Foundation is about. So James Randi is a well-known magician, escape artist, and skeptic. So he's not a magician like someone who believes in magic and is promoting magic. He's not like a psychic. He's actually known for debunking psychics and other people who are proposing themselves to have some sort of supernatural ability or something like that.
So he's more of an illusionist?
Yeah, sometimes people use that term instead, illusionist versus magician. Some people use the terms interchangeably, but basically he's not someone who actually pretends to have supernatural powers or anything like that. He's learned the techniques of, quote-unquote magic or illusion, professionally fooling people for entertainment, that sort of thing. So, like, if he does a magic show, like he makes it very clear to everyone, this is all just tricks for the sake of entertainment, and I don't have any psychic abilities or supernatural abilities or anything. These are just simple things that anyone can learn, and they're skills that could be developed, and so on and so forth. And we've all seen card tricks, and we've all seen, whatever, like escape artists and whatever. And James Randi was an escape artist, among many other different things. He broke all of Houdini's records. So I know people usually think, oh, Houdini, like the greatest escape artist. But actually James Randi was apparently a better escape artist. But one of the great things about James Randi is how he really makes it a point to use magic to educate people. And just to be clear, I'm not promoting magic. Even James Randi doesn't promote quote-unquote magic. I'm actually just explaining this to give you background information on who James Randi is in order to understand the James Randi Foundation. So anyway, I forget exactly when this was, whether it was the 70s or the 80s, but there was an individual, an Israeli by the name of Uri Geller, and he went around, on a whole bunch of TV shows and was doing these magic tricks and saying that he has this psychic ability, and, he would bend spoons with his mind and things like that. And so James Randi, what he would do is he would then go on these shows and show how this other guy does it and say he doesn't really have any psychic abilities. He is just doing magic tricks and fooling people to think that he has all these psychic abilities. And he actually went and he develops tests, experiments, in order to test these proposed abilities that people have. And so there was a whole bunch of other people who claimed to have some sort of ability, and he would go on these shows and he would say, okay, well, let's try and do this. Demonstrate your ability, but we will put a test on it. So one guy, he said that he could flip pages in a phone book just using his mind. And James Randi said, no, he's not really actually flipping them with his mind. He's just very subtly blowing on the pages to have them move. So let's do a test where we're going to take a whole bunch of really light, fluffy packing material and put it right on the table in front of and beside the pages and have him try to move it then. So this guy gets there and he's going and he's putting himself in this pose like he always does, where he's really concentrating. And he's like, the energy's not right. And he ends up not doing it. And this would happen so often when James Randi would go and bring people to the test. For some reason, they can't do it because the energy is not right. And so he would really go around and show people who are actually frauds, or he would show people to be frauds that are actually frauds. Another one is Peter Popov, who some of you may be familiar with. He was famous for being a faith healer, like a televangelist faith healer. And all these people would come on his show. People would watch it on TV. People would come to his events, and he would, there'd be people who couldn't walk and people who had whatever disease or disability or whatever, and he would heal them and push their forehead and all these things. And it was quite the show, and people would go, and he was getting totally rich off this. And so James Randi, he had a friend who, he hired a private detective who had equipment to find and listen in on radio waves, because he noticed that Peter Popov wears a hearing aid, and he said, that's a little odd for someone who can just heal all manner of disease, and he has a hearing aid. So he thought, well, maybe he's listening into something and someone's feeding him information on people, because what Peter Popov would do, he would stand in front of a crowd and he'd say, someone needs healing tonight. And he'd look around the crowd and, you, in the third row, second seat in, your name's Fanny, whatever, give their name, and they'd be like, yeah, that's my name. And he's spotting people and just giving their name and telling them information about themselves, and it seems so miraculous. He's saying, the Holy Spirit's telling me this about you. And so anyway, James Randi wondered if maybe he's just getting fed information through his hearing aid. And so he went and got his private detective there, and they listened in, and they heard Peter Popov's wife saying, Petey, you there? If you can't hear me, we're in deep shit. And, that's what they heard. That was the first thing once they got tuned in. It was basically that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the content. And it was really like, okay, well, obviously they're catching him. And they listened in, and what had happened is she went around talking to people before the event started and going, oh, hi, welcome. We're glad that you're here. Why are you here? Do you have any problems? And people would tell, like, what was wrong with them. And there'd be someone else there kind of going along with Peter Popov's wife, writing down notes, literally, as they're going around and getting people to fill out prayer cards, giving them information, and they'd be back behind the scenes going through it, and then she'd be feeding the information to Peter Popov live, and he'd be supposedly miraculously getting this information from the Holy Spirit. And then James Randi took this and exposed it on national television and basically said, either God sounds like Peter Popov's wife or this is a fraud. And obviously it was a fraud. And so that's the kind of thing that James Randi is known for, and testing people who say they can read auras and so on. So anyway, he started this foundation, that's the James Randi Foundation, which is devoted to testing supernatural claims. And it actually offers $1 million to anyone who can demonstrate that they have a supernatural ability. And the test comes in 2 phases. First, they have to be able to demonstrate that they can do what they claim to do. And then they have to show that they are not doing it by trickery, that it's actually genuinely a supernatural ability. Anyone who can do that will win $1 million. And they've tested many, many people over the years, and so far no one has even passed the first test. And everyone who enters to do this test agrees on all the conditions and terms of the experiment. Like, they work together to develop an experiment. So they actually believe that they can do what they claim to do, and then the experiment shows that they can't. So that's one of the main things that the James Randi Foundation is devoted to doing. The other thing is to generally provide education to the public concerning healthy skepticism and basically testing claims on the supernatural and on other things. And so, yeah, James Randi Foundation, I think, is doing a very good work, and the James Randi Foundation YouTube channel has some good information. And one of the kind of products that they have put out is this series of 10 videos on the topic of science-based medicine by a doctor named Harriet Hall. And Harriet Hall also is one of the contributors to an internet blog called Science-Based Medicine, which we have actually had as one of our recommended resources on the bdsca.com website for a long time. And I didn't even realize that she was one of the contributors to that blog until I watched the first video in her series on the James Randi Foundation YouTube channel. And then she mentioned about the Science-Based Medicine blog and how she's one of the people who started it. And so anyway, it's all recommended information. And I really do recommend for everyone studying the message to watch that series of videos, because she really goes through a lot of detail in explaining what is wrong with the type of proposed medicine which is not actually valid, and how to distinguish between what is valid and what is not valid. And she goes through several examples, because having bad examples is very helpful in highlighting kind of what to look for and what to not look for. And so she has a video on homeopathy. She has a video on acupuncture. She has a video on chiropractic. She has a video on naturopathy. Some say naturopathy, I suppose. Through several different specific pseudoscientific health claims or health fields, and really goes through the information in a very detailed, coherent way. And then her first two videos are more so setting out the foundation principles, and then the last ones are kind of summarizing and giving some really helpful information and good resources and so on in terms of testing claims and how to know whether something is a good study or not a good study. Like, anyone can publish a study on something, but a study isn't even necessarily evidence of anything, because maybe it was very poorly conducted, and a lot of studies are poorly conducted and don't actually prove anything. So it's a very, very useful series, and I'm sure there's a lot more on the James Randi Foundation YouTube channel. Some videos on there actually are videos of the experiments of testing claims, where someone goes to the James Randi Foundation hoping to win $1 million by proving their supernatural ability, and sometimes the whole experiment is filmed and posted on their YouTube channel. So the vast majority of what's on that YouTube channel I haven't seen, so I can't really speak to it, but I recommend checking it out, and I definitely recommend the Science-Based Medicine series. And she really contrasts and shows the difference between complementary and alternative medicine, also known as CAM, C-A-M, as compared to true science-based medicine. And absolutely what this message advocates is science-based medicine, not complementary and alternative medicine. And it is very important to know the difference between the two, not only just the difference between, these are the conclusions that science-based medicine has found versus these are the conclusions that alternative-based medicine has come up with. It's not just knowing the difference in the conclusions of either field, if you will, but it's also knowing the difference in the principles by which they both operate. Because when you really understand the principles by which complementary and alternative medicine operate, it becomes quite apparent that they are false principles, and that the claims put forward are not true claims, and they have a faulty foundation, and so on. And science-based medicine is really where it's at as far as medicine goes. That is where you will find valid things. And the reason for this is very simple. It is that science-based medicine is founded upon evidence. And actually, one of the things that Harriet Hall discusses is how evidence-based medicine, for a long time people have been promoting evidence-based medicine, but the term science-based medicine is kind of a further development to emphasize that the type of evidence that we're talking about genuine scientific evidence, rather than simply what might be perceived to be evidence. Like, you might come up with a study, but what if your study is faulty? Well, you might say that that's evidence, but if it's not genuine evidence, and if it doesn't take into account all of the information that has been discovered, then it's not actually true evidence. So the term science-based medicine is intended to communicate a far broader perspective. So it's kind of like this, like evidence-based medicine might just say, well, we need a study in order to show this. Like, let's do an experiment. But science-based medicine is saying we need more than just one experiment, one test. We need to have peer review. We need to have repeated tests and we need systematic review of our experiments. We need to look at all of the available information and really examine the quality of the studies that have been done, and and she didn't use this term, but I'll use the term that I've used, do an indirect experiment on the validity of all the experiments in order to gain the most accurate knowledge. And that's one thing that came through very well in her series of videos. I've emphasized before the difference between direct experiment and indirect experiment. And even though it's counterintuitive, I've emphasized the fact that indirect experiment is actually where you have the most reliable and broadest information. That's where you can gain genuine and full knowledge of something. It's through the indirect experimentation. And if someone needs to ask me more about that, feel free to ask. I'll say a few other things first, but if you're wondering, like if you're not all that clear on that distinguishing factor, ask me. So basically, it was really nice. I had never seen another person kind of emphasize those same principles so clearly, but Harriet Hall in this series of science-based medicine, even though she didn't use the terms direct experiment and indirect experiment or anything like that, that's what she's talking about in principle. It's the same thing. She talks about kind of like the immediate experiment of, you have a particular hypothesis and you test it and you run an experiment. You have a controlled trial or whatever. But that only goes so far. Really, to gain knowledge of the issue, you need to have an analysis of all the experiments that have been done and to test whether they were valid experiments, and then do a systematic review of everything. And so that's the term that she used, doing a systematic review, and then even a systematic review of systematic reviews. Really, that's the same thing that we've been talking about as an indirect experiment. That is so powerful, and that's what science-based medicine is about. When you look at pseudoscientific medicine, often there aren't even experiments that are done. Often it is simply people having anecdotal stories of, oh, well, this helped me, or whatever, and this hasn't been tested, but it's good for you, and it'll help you, and people end up buying into it and using something just because it's an herb or whatever, and so it shouldn't harm you. And that's not actually true. Herbs can harm you. You can actually have negative side effects from herbs. And, there's a lot of things people end up going along with certain things, and, we've all, in our own group here, at least formerly, have been at least buying into the alternative health type of world and the ideas promoted therein. And we've really, in coming to understand materialism, spoken out against things like energy healing, homeopathy, and a lot of these different things which are based on immaterial thinking, chi energy, and what have you. But there's a lot aside from that too. Like, there's just things that are not actually based on valid evidence. And, we've talked about so many times in these calls how we should not believe something unless we know it. And the only way to know it is to have valid experimentation of the issue. Well, it's the same thing with health. Like, to apply that to health, let's just say that someone promotes something as being a treatment or a cure for a certain ailment. You should not believe that it is a valid treatment or cure until you know that it is a valid treatment or cure. And you cannot know that without genuine experimentation. Now, the other thing that I'll add is that you should not act upon something without believing it, and you should not believe it without knowing it. So someone might say, well, I don't really know if this is going to help, but I'm going to do it anyway. Even though it's not tested or whatever, I'm just going to try it. Well, that's not really the best way to do it. The better way is to refrain from taking ourselves things which are not substantiated to be legitimate, and to abstain from promoting things which are not substantiated to be legitimate. And so even if something isn't going to harm someone with their health, but isn't actually going to help them with their problem, it would not be good to recommend something to someone that is not shown to actually help their problem. So it's really important for us to really understand these principles. And I guess there's a lot that I could say in regard to specifics and particular principles. And you know, I think it's very important for everyone here to understand the placebo effect, what it is and what to learn from it. It's very important for people to understand really the difference between science-based medicine and alternative medicine in general. And there are just so many different kind of subcategories. Like, you need to understand how to know whether a test is actually a valid test or not. Because in the alternative health field, a lot of it isn't even based on any experiment. But then sometimes there are experiments that people conduct. And people use very scientific-sounding terms, and this is what pseudoscience really is. There's folk medicine. Folk medicine isn't itself pseudoscientific necessarily, because a lot of folk medicine doesn't try to be scientific. But then there's pseudoscientific medicine. Pseudoscientific medicine looks like medicine, sounds like medicine, but it's not valid medicine. So if it's pseudoscientific medicine, maybe the people who are advocating it are dressed like doctors. Maybe they use terms that sound scientific. Maybe they talk about quantum fields, and they talk about vibrations and energies, and they, say that they've done an experiment and whatever. But just because someone's done a test on something doesn't mean it's valid. You could have 500 studies that have been done on a particular issue, and let's say 20 of them show positive results, but the other, 480 show negative results, and you've been looking online and you happen to just read the 20 that show positive, well, man, you might convince yourself like, oh, man, I just read a study or, a explanation or a report of a study that was positive for this certain thing. And then I found another one, and I found another one, and I found another one, and there's 20 of them. Well, you might think like, man, there's a lot of evidence for this. But you have to make sure that if those are 20 studies, you have to make sure that those are 20 valid studies. Like, was this done on just a very small group of people? How was the study reported? Do you really know the details of the study? And were there other studies that showed contrary results? Did people try and replicate this and were unable? So maybe you find a study where it says, by using this treatment, and this is an example that Harriet Hall gives, where someone might say, oh, well, in this study, using this remedy increased the recovery rate by 200%. Well, that sounds pretty good. Well, all that means is that it's doubling it. But let's say you have it where you have 1 million people, and without the treatment, one person did it, and then, without the treatment, one person did it, and then with the treatment, it was 2 people. Well, that's a 200% increase, but it still doesn't prove anything because that's still only 2 people out of 1 million. So, it's very important to know how to read studies well and to tell the difference between poorly conducted studies and actually valuable studies, and to be able to do a systematic review, which is why we have Cochrane Institute and the Cochrane Library linked to on the resources page of our website, because Cochrane Library is all about doing systematic reviews of medical studies. And so what it will do is say, okay, well, someone will say, I am going to do a review of all of the studies that have been published in the scientific medical literature on this particular drug for treating heart disease, a particular heart disease. Okay, so now that person does the review and says, okay, there have been 75 studies done on this, and let's look at each study. Well, this study failed to have a control. This study was on a very small population, and they missed doing this and that and that. And so you go through all the studies to see however many of them were actually valid studies, how many of them were over a long period of time and included a lot of people. Was something actually a study on people, or was it a study on other animals? If it was on other animals, is this a circumstance where how the drug affected those other animals is actually a good reflection of how it will reflect humans? Because sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes a drug may interact a certain way in the body of a lab rat, but it wouldn't interact in that same way with a human. And so, for a systematic review, you have to take all those things into account, really, really analyze all the studies that have been done, and then draw conclusions based on a broad range of data. And so that's very useful. That's really, really good and helpful information. So that's what we should be interested in when we want to know about health. We definitely shouldn't want to find our health information from proponents of complementary and alternative health. We should seek for science-based medicine. And even among science, people who are in more conventional mainstream medicine practices, we need to recognize that not everyone is practicing the standard of true science-based medicine. And one study, even someone may do a very good study and really try their best, but they may end up inadvertently missing something and losing a control on something that alters the results, or having a bias that they don't even realize is altering how they're doing the experiment. And so there has to be other studies performed by other people repeating it. And so you really want to have the full information available to you. So I just wanted to ask at this point if anyone has any comments or questions in regard to any of this or wants to add to what I'm saying. And yeah, let's discuss it.
I'll just comment. I like what you're saying. We've kind of gone down some of the homeopathic path in our past, and I've always struggled with it. And I don't know, it's just kind of refreshing to really look at everything objectively, and I like the idea of being forced to make decisions in reality. That's really what we're talking about here.
I really like how you put that. Yeah, absolutely. That's it. That's what it's about.
Everybody knows this, of course, but I've been into the homeopathics and the acupuncture and just all kinds of things, anecdotal all the way, and and again a lot of evidence. I'm sure that again, quote unquote evidence based, lots of tests. I mean, you can get any health magazine from any certain vitamin company, and they're showing that they're doing all kinds of scientific tests. But are those tests valid? You know, I question that now. I question that a ton now, and I just shudder to think of the thousands of dollars I have spent, probably wasted. You know, and maybe even harmful, and maybe some helpful, but it's kind of horrifying now. But I do agree with Ed. I do love the idea of science-based medicine and reality, and I'm okay with saying he was right.
Well, that's awesome. Like, seriously, I just find that so awesome how it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously if we love the truth, if it turns out that someone else was right and we were wrong, yeah, we should be happy, like, to find that out, and then it's like, okay, cool. You know, with one of the things that you said reminded me of something that Harriet Hall pointed out in her lectures. She mentioned the confusion between correlation and causation. You know, we often think that if two things correlate or coincide or took place at the same time, that one caused the other. And obviously that's not always true. Like, if you happen to dance when the rain falls, you might think that your dancing is what brought the rain, but that's not actually what brought the rain at all. And so, of course, the whole idea of the rain dance developed because of confusing correlation with causation. And that's basically what superstition is. And I think I've mentioned on the calls before an experiment that was done by a psychologist in like the 1950s or something, where he took pigeons and put them in cages and had it feed them at an automatic time. And then he switched it to have it feed them on random. And what would happen is that if one bird happened to do a particular thing, like move in a weird way or look over its shoulder just before the food came, all of a sudden it would really start to do that a lot. It would really, like, it thought that by doing that motion, it was bringing the food on. And so it was basically doing, in effect, the equivalent of a rain dance. So you'd have a bird that would just go nuts, looking over its left shoulder all the time, thinking that that was bringing its food. So the psychologist referred to it as superstitious behavior, which I would agree. But humans do that too much. And so what one of the examples that Harriet Hall gave was the correlation between increase of vaccines and increase of children diagnosed with autism, and how people have looked at this correlation over a few decades and said, see, therefore vaccines cause autism, because, oh, it can't be coincidence that at the same time that there's more vaccines, there's more autism being diagnosed. That can't be coincidence. But she showed how if you chart out the sales of organic produce and the increase of diagnoses for autism, they parallel each other almost exactly. Like, it's really, really, really close. Like, there's,
in other words, it's a more direct correlation on the chart, you know, visually on the chart. It's more identical than the vaccination rate with diagnosis of autism.
Yeah. Like, it's not just simply a rise. It's like the actual curve is the same. And Harriet Hall was not trying to say that eating organic food causes autism. She was just pointing out that, look, just because there's a correlation does not mean that there is a causation. And she's like, I don't think anyone would suggest that, you know, organic food sales have anything to do with autism. And there's really no evidence that that's the case. But that's the point. There is a correlation between the increase of organic food and the increase of autism, I'll qualify again, being diagnosed. But that isn't evidence that one caused the other. And so, you know, it's the same thing like with vaccines. It's important for people not to be like, oh, well, there's there's a correlation here, therefore one must have caused the other. Because it doesn't make sense. There are things that correlate just by chance. That's just the way it is. And
one reason why you said I'll qualify with diagnosed is because, like the ability to diagnose autism has increased. Like testing is better equipped to identify autism today than it was however many years ago. Just like with other diseases, we know about them now more so, or they seem to be more common only because we know about them, but years ago they may have existed just as much as now, but weren't identified. So it could be, I'm not saying one way or the other, but the point is that it could be that there isn't that much of an increase in autism. It's just being diagnosed more often.
Exactly. Because, hey, guess what? There are more doctors, more hospitals.
Greater awareness.
Greater awareness, exactly. And so it's more likely that it will be diagnosed. And, it could be that the actual disease has risen too, like Teresa said. We're not trying to say that it has or hasn't. I don't think either of us know for sure one way or the other.
No, I don't know.
It's just that diagnosis increase does not mean disease increase. And an increase of diagnosis happening to parallel an increase of something else happening in the world doesn't mean that there was any correlation between the two things. So, yeah, just really, really important for us to keep those principles in mind. And it's just so easy to not just be happy with looking at the evidence, whatever it is. It's so easy sometimes for people to, really it's because of an ideology where just the thought of like, oh man, what if vaccines actually aren't bad? What if vaccines are actually good and we should all be getting vaccines? People don't like to entertain that thought because they're emotionally invested in thinking that vaccines are bad for you. And often that's tied to a conspiratorial thinking where we're thinking, oh, this is all big pharma. And it's all the pharmaceutical companies like making tons of money off drugs, which is actually, by the way, not actually really true because it takes years and often decades and a lot of research and a lot of money to actually develop a certain drug. And, it's not like people are making a whole lot of money off of that, actually, at all. And so, and it's the same thing like scientists who are doing this research, they get grant money to do their research. That's not their paycheck. They're not getting rich off of this stuff. That's just the reality of it. So often people have this conspiracy where, oh, it's the evil pharmaceutical companies out to get us, or, oh, it's the government trying to dumb us all down. And there's all these conspiracies, and people use those paradigms to not actually consider the evidence. And it's really important for people to just, honestly, to get past that. And I know that getting past that isn't simply a matter of telling someone, you got to get over that way of thinking. It's a matter of educating. We need to educate ourselves, and it's a willingness to conform our approach, to conform our way of thinking to the evidence, and to get rid of our idols of conspiratorial thinking and whatever it may be that might hold us back from really just considering the evidence. Like, hey, if it's true that vaccines are actually really important and really good, and if it's true that chemotherapy is actually a good treatment against cancer, if it's true that whatever, like all these different things that are advocated in science-based medicine, if that's actually all good for you, we should be happy to find out. We should be happy to know it. And again, it's just the social dynamics and the political dynamics that often influence people. I've mentioned the political dynamics already, where you might have a political perspective that's conspiratorial, but then there could also be social dynamics where you may have friends or people who you interact with who have those perspectives that have influenced you to have those perspectives, and that might be a social pressure on you, where you might subconsciously even just continue with that perspective because, oh, I don't want to be one of those people who's, having a quote-unquote mainstream perspective. And mainstream, by the way, I will say that science-based medicine, unfortunately, is not mainstream. There's so much, like, among celebrities, among media, there's a lot of promotion of alternative stuff, alternative, not substantiated medicine and treatments and whatever. Like, that's actually more the mainstream. The alternative stuff seems to have more popularity until it comes to something that you really have to go to the hospital for. Then pretty much anyone is going to go to get a surgery when they really need a surgery or whatever. But, it's, these are just very, very important things to keep in mind, important principles. Evidence-based medicine really matters. Evidence-based everything else, just like Silver Trumpet Volume 1, Number 9. We want evidence-based archaeology, philosophy, politics, theology, history, whatever it may be, everything. I think someone was going to make a comment or ask a question.
I have a question/comment. Let's see, you guys taught me this a couple of years ago. There's something in 6 BC, and I'm not sure what BC stands for. It's Ellen White writing, page 1054. It says, no faith in casting lots. Let none be led from the sound, sensible principles that God has laid down for the guidance of his people to depend for direction on any such device as the tossing up of coins. Such a course is well-pleasing to the enemy of souls, for he works to control the coin, and through its agency works out his plans. Let none be so easily deceived as to place confidence in any such tests. Let none belittle their experience by resorting to cheap devices for direction in important matters connected with the work of God. And I think this was used really in reference even to health, that Satan can use kind of random things, random objects to direct people in the area of like yes/no type questions. And again, I was really big into the pendulum for answering health questions. Really, you could answer any question with it, or you were getting an answer. Like it wasn't like it really was going left, or it really was going right. It really was stopping at a certain number, almost like a Ouija board kind of thing, and I was not controlling it, and it was actually doing something. Again, maybe I was controlling it and wasn't realizing it, but I certainly wasn't trying to. And I don't know. I know Ellen White didn't really speak exactly to a pendulum, but just saying that Satan could control the toss of a coin, to come out with the result that he would want. That certainly it really fooled me. The pendulum did because something was controlling it, and it wasn't me. And I thought it was like an energy field. I really did. I read a book called The Field by Lynn McTaggart, and I believe now that I believe, and I don't know that this is true, or this is what I'm asking you, was Satan controlling the pendulum? Is that possible? I know you might not really know that, and it would probably require scientific tests. Maybe it's on this YouTube channel. I don't know, but do you have any insight on that?
Sure, yeah, it's an excellent question. So I don't know for the specific circumstances, like in your particular case, or if it was even multiple different things, different times when you would use a pendulum. And the other thing that I'll say is that it's not an either-or thing. One thing that I will say is that it is known that one way that pendulums swing is by something known as the ideomotor effect, and that's subconscious movements that are very subtle, but when you have a piece of equipment that is very sensitive, you can cause it to move. And like totally, honestly, not trying to, not knowing that you are, all of that. But it is a real phenomenon called the ideomotor effect where we can move things. This takes place also with dowsing, using dowsing rods. Well, the way that they're held and the shape of the object and everything, like they move very easily anyway, just like a pendulum. You don't have a lot of control over it. And because you don't have a lot of control over it, the slightest motion can make it move in different ways without you barely doing anything. But all of us, like our bodies are constantly moving. It's very hard to like hold your fingers perfectly still. And so the ideomotor effect is a known effect, and it does cause a lot of motion for very sensitive objects without people knowing that they are causing motion. Same thing is in effect with muscle testing, by the way. The ideomotor effect is in effect in those circumstances. But so here's the thing. The reason why I said it's not necessarily either or is because it's a subconscious thing that takes place, the ideomotor effect. And if the devil is able to influence someone in their subconscious, in their psychology, that would cause them to unknowingly move it a certain way, then he could influence the results without actually having his hands in there. Like it's physically hands-on, just the person doing it, but they have been influenced to subconsciously do it in a certain way. Same thing could happen with the toss of a coin, where it's not necessarily Satan like invisibly going and like causing it to turn a number of times by touching it in a certain way. It's more likely a lot more subtle than that, and it could more easily happen. I would think that the easiest way to do it would be to just influence the person so that subconsciously they end up altering the results without even knowing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And that's something you can Google too. You guys can Google it or YouTube it, the ideomotor effect, and it'll explain more fully what it is, and I'm sure you can find some demonstrations of it.
Hey, Trent. That we were talking about this whole subject the other night, right? So, I think it's worth sharing my question to you that evening as well about, let's say when you have a disease and you've been going to the doctor and you've been prescribed, medication after medication after medication, nothing's working, and comes to the point where, the doctor now saying, there's not much more I can give you. So I had asked you, what would be wrong in, or would there be anything wrong in resorting to alternative medicine, since, let's say, the person's, had some experience with success with some, alternative medication from the past, and therefore the doctor says, well, you're welcome to try anything. So can we discuss that principle we talked about?
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad that you're mentioning that. So basically I'll just kind of repeat in essence the answer that I gave to you at the time, and that is that even if you've tried however many things that your doctor has recommended and it doesn't work, and even if your doctor says, well, just try whatever, wouldn't make it right to just try whatever or try something from alternative medicine or whatever. In fact, it would be better not to. And there's a few different factors involved. One is that not every doctor is science-based. So a doctor may recommend something that isn't actually the best thing to do. And I'm going to actually kind of take a slight detour for a second just to say that often people who are into alternative medicine misrepresent mainstream medicine and misrepresent those who don't follow alternative medicine by saying things like, oh, you're just going to listen to whatever your doctor tells you, and alternative medicine gives an illusion of, oh, you're in control of your own health. That's totally a false illusion. Like, that's not at all the case, that when you go with alternative medicine, you're in control of your own health, whereas if you go to doctors, you're not. If you go to alternative medicine, you may end up just taking the word of the person at the health food store or the person who sells your supplements or your whatever practitioner it may be. You might just take their word for it, just like someone else takes the word of the doctor for it. And that's actually what happens a lot. And so it's not better control, it's actually worse control, because not only are you not in control of your health, partially because you're taking things that don't work, but also the person isn't even in control. Like, the person who you're buying whatever from might really believe in a certain product, but often alternative stuff is not well regulated. And so the person who's selling it isn't even in control of what's in it, and they don't even know for sure what's in it because it's not well regulated. And when tests have been done to find out the actual substances present in a lot of alternative remedies and supplements and so on, very often it's not what's on the label. Sometimes what's on the label is there too. I'm not saying that it's like totally something else, although sometimes that is the case. But it's often in not controlled doses, and there's often other things there that are not on the label and things like that. And that's just totally not controlled. That's totally a false paradigm, thinking that when you're having alternative medicine, you are in control of your own health, whereas if you go to doctors, you're not. So anyways, back to the doctor thing. Not all doctors are science-based, and they may recommend things that are not actually good. Not all doctors are up-to-date with the best health information, even if they're well-meaning. I mean, there's a lot to keep track of as a doctor. And maybe, you'll go to a doctor who keeps track of certain things pretty well, keeps up to date with certain things, because let's say they have a number of patients who have a certain, have certain illnesses that are more common. Yeah. So they might end up being more specialized in a certain area, even without being a specialist, sometimes even with being a specialist. But even without being a specialist, let's just say they're a family doctor, maybe they just happen to have more experience in certain areas because they happen to have more people with that particular issue. And then you might go to them with your issue.
Did we cut out?
You did. Yes.
Okay, I'll go back for a minute then. A doctor may be more familiar with certain ailments because they've dealt with those ailments in their patients a lot more than others. And you might go to that same doctor who may be actually a good doctor, and you have a certain ailment that they are not that experienced with. And maybe they are familiar with it from when they were in medical school, but maybe it's been 20 years since they've been in medical school. And they might just have out-of-date information. And so they may recommend something that wouldn't be best to recommend. And perhaps they just, either didn't think to check or didn't have the time to check, or were under the impression that what they had heard last was the best information, but perhaps it's not anymore. And so for that reason, in the example that you've given, Anna, let's say someone goes to the doctor and they've tried everything the doctor said, and then they've come to that place. Well, what they should do really at that point is to look at valid resources like the Cochrane Institute, and there are other good science-based medicine resources out there, and to find out if there's been any research that is really valid, like what systematic reviews have been done on their disease, and if they find that there are things that have been shown to be effective that they haven't tried, then go with those things. And then if they find that, unfortunately, there just hasn't been enough research, then what they should do is try to promote for research to be done. If they can raise money for research on those issues, or if they can just raise awareness of the disease so that people can actually donate. And and this is actually, I'll give an example. My dad has chronic fatigue, and it has a couple other longer names that are hard to pronounce, but more commonly known as chronic fatigue. And it is something that millions of people have, and not a lot of research has been done on it. There are a few interesting experiments that have shown some correlations, but it's not enough to really show anything as to what the real cause is or what chronic fatigue really even is. And there are not any truly effective treatments that have been found yet. So there are some people, and with chronic fatigue it's really tough because really it's like being so drained and having so little energy, and taking a nap doesn't help. You'll have to take a lot of naps just to keep going, and it's just really hard to do anything. And so for that particular issue, it's very difficult because those who are most aware of the disease are those who have it, but they are the least likely people to become activists for something because they have so little energy. But in spite of that, there are some among them who really muster up all the energy that they have and put it forward to raise awareness about chronic fatigue. And they're even making a documentary and all of that, and really trying to raise money for research to be done because they want a science-based answer. And guess what? If there's going to be an answer, science is the way that it'll be found. It won't be found through alternative medicine. And so I totally am really proud of and inspired by those who are devoting their lives to raising awareness of this disease and trying to raise funding for research. That's awesome. That should be done. And that should be done for a whole bunch of different diseases. If I had a serious illness and there wasn't enough research, what I would do and what I would recommend for others to do is to not just go down the alternative health route, but rather to raise awareness, raise money for research, and become an activist for conquering that disease. And I would rather die doing that. Let's say just in my lifetime, let's say I only had 6 months to live, and I did that. No, obviously I will say that the extent to which I would do that would be less than it might for others because I have another mission. So I would actually probably devote my time to writing as much as possible on the message, just to be clear. But let's say someone doesn't have this message. What should they do in that circumstance? Well, they should devote their time to bettering the world, and they have this disease. They're aware of it, so they should make others aware of it, and they should try and raise money for research on that. And let's say that there is some sort of alternative thing that they've used before and it seemed to help their symptoms or something, like they seemed to feel better when they did it. Well, what they should do is they should study to find out, like they should see if there have been tests for that remedy and if they showed promise or if they showed that it was only the placebo effect, that it really wasn't improving anything. Like a lot of stuff has already been tested and has been shown to be not legitimate or even damaging or at least ineffective. And then a lot of things, if haven't been studied, and for anything that hasn't, if they had a positive experience with it, well, maybe they should try and raise money so that scientists can actually do some research on testing that. And then if it turns out that it's good, well, then use it, but don't go and use it without having it tested first with real tests, and not just one, but, repeated and really going through the scientific peer-reviewed process on it. So, that's really what I would recommend. It would be better to die advocating truth and evidence-based science and medicine and knowledge rather than going the other way and potentially dying but feeling better by placebo perhaps just by putting your time and money into something that isn't shown to work. The other thing, too, that could happen that would be quite negative is if someone ended up going down the alternative medicine path and actually getting better and thinking that it was whatever remedy they took that actually healed them when perhaps it wasn't, because that happens a lot. People might take something and they think that that was what did it, but maybe it was something else. Maybe there was some sort of lifestyle change that they didn't even know they made. Maybe there was an environmental factor. What if the disease was already in remission? Things like that already happen. So, someone like, here's a good example with pain. Often when people have pain, like if it's just little pain, they might not take anything. And then if they start to get a lot more pain, they might take something. But here's the thing, very often with pain, you might have pain, it'll be bad, and then it'll get worse, and then it'll start to get better again. Like that's just the natural course of what often happens with pain. And so since you take whatever you're going to take for your pain when you're feeling it with the most, even if it doesn't do anything, you might start to feel better anyway. But if you take it, you're going to think that it was whatever herb or whatever pill or whatever it may have been that you took. You might think that that was it. Or it might just be placebo, where it's the psychological impact where you convince yourself that you are not actually experiencing the pain and thus you don't feel it. And you might feel better even though it didn't really help you. And so it would be pretty bad to take some sort of remedy that's not tested, that's not proven to help, and then to convince yourself that it is what made the difference. And then you might go on promoting it to others, and someone else might have something with the same symptoms that you have, and you say, oh, take this, it'll help. And they might take it thinking that it'll help, and maybe they'll think it's helping them, but maybe it won't, and maybe they didn't even have the same thing that you had. It's just the same symptoms, and then they end up going untreated and damaging their bodies and perhaps even dying if it's a serious thing because you promoted for them to take something that you thought helped you when really it's not what they needed. And that's a really important thing. People end up offering people health advice all the time when they don't actually know what's wrong with the person. They have not been properly diagnosed. Even if you do a proper scientific experiment, even the best scientific experiments most often do not have 100% accuracy. And so it's important when diagnosing disease to often do more than one experiment and often repeating the experiments to verify whether it was a fluke, like a false positive, or whatever. You could even have a false negative. So it's really important, guys, I just want to emphasize this for everyone, not to offer health advice to people unless you really know what their problem is and you really know that what you are going to offer is the solution. So anyway, I think I heard someone come off mute a minute ago. Was there someone with a comment or question? Okay, well, perhaps not. We should wrap up the meeting soon, within the next 10 minutes, but I will ask if anyone else does have any closing comments or questions. Okay, it doesn't sound like it. Does anyone want to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we thank you so much for this opportunity to talk as a group just about science-based medicine and the truth. And I thank you for science. I thank you for research. I thank you for so many people that have done lots of work in this area for the betterment of humanity. And so I pray that you would bless us and bless us with, lead us basically to the truth so that we can improve our health and improve our bodies and be better able to serve you to bring in your kingdom. In the name of the branch, he and she, amen.
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 Shabbat shalom, everyone. Have a good night. Happy Sabbath.
Laila Tov.
Night.
Love you all. Laila Tov.